Welcome back, guys. I hope you liked the first chapter and you had as much fun as I had by building and creating your base of that small diorama here. I think it's very interesting and fantastic how easy to use our NOCH Terraform system is. So you don't need any heavy tools. It is very tidy and you can build up layouts without ruining your living room. That's quite cool. So I hope you like it. Now we are ready for chapter 2, for the second stage of our diorama. I already prepared something here. But before I start to tell you something about the model, I want you to know that the more important part is the preparation for the modeling. So first of all, if you have the possibility or opportunity to grab your hiking boots and go outside into the mountain area, just do it. That's the very best way to get into the mood as well as to get into all the details you want to model later on. So grab a camera, go out there, take some pictures of rocks, of mountains, of meadows, of all these scenes that are happening in the region you want to create as a model here. If you don't have the opportunity to go outside, maybe because it's winter where you're living and you can't go into the green mountains because there is snow in the moment, you can also use Google picture search, or even better, Instagram. So Instagram is something I really love because there you can look for hashtags like mountainscapes and something like this. And there you can have a look at all these pictures from all of these fantastic artists that are uploading their pictures there. So very easy to prepare for you. You can do it at home, maybe with a beer in your hands. That's somehow sometimes more fun than even hiking in the real region. And just get an idea or more ideas of what you want to build as a model here. Before we start working, it is very important to grab an old newspaper or something and to cover your table, because we are working with compound as well as with these colors here, so we don't want to ruin our table. So make sure that it is covered. Second, we are working with rock molds in this video tutorial here. What brings a big advantage? These rock moldings are filled with compound, so you can produce your own rocks, and the very big advantage about that is that you can produce as many rocks as you want. So do some more as you need and use them as pieces to check and to try out your abilities on coloring, for example. So before you use the natural colors on the real diorama, on your masterpiece, do some test pieces and just get into the mood, just get into the technique, learn about colors and how they are used and what color comes out how on these rocks. So that is one of my tips up front. Just make sure to have enough rock pieces, even a little more than you need for testing reasons. And then join in, have a look at the tutorial. I will show you which tools you will need. I will show you which items and products from NOCH you will need, and then we go through it together, and afterwards you will be able to create rocks like this. Have fun!
To design the rocky sections, we would like to cast the rocks ourselves. This method offers the possibility to design large rocky sections for a reasonable price, since the NOCH rock forming molds can be used as often as required. Many different molds are available in the NOCH range, with which rocks, rock faces and rock pieces of different sizes can be casted. A special feature of the rock forming molds by NOCH is the integrated casting frame. It is made directly out of the packaging's backing cardboard and enables the rock forming mold to be inserted evenly and thus poured out. We first cut the backing cardboard into two parts along the dotted line. These two parts are then stuck together with two adhesive strips to form a frame. The rock forming molds are now placed in the prepared frames, so that the rocks can be removed more easily later. We spray the rock forming molds with water, to which 1 to 2 drops of washing up liquid has been added before filling them. The rock forming molds are now fully prepared and ready to be filled. NOCH PROFI casting compound can be mixed very easily in a ratio of 3:1. For this, we use a rubber mixing bowl for plaster from a hardware store. Kitchen scales are very helpful when mixing. Then the bowl is filled with the desired amount of NOCH PROFI casting compound, for example 60 grams, which makes up 3 parts. Now we add water in the same unit, in our case grams. The two components are then stirred to form an even, creamy casting compound. A tip: instead of a plaster spatula, I personally prefer a simple tablespoon. This makes it easier to get into the corners of the bowl when stirring, and you can later fill small rock forming molds directly with a spoon. The casting compound is poured directly into the prepared moistened rock forming molds. Larger rocks are poured out of the bowl. Small rocks can easily be filled with the help of the spoon. Note: the volumes required for pouring are indicated on the packaging of the rock casting molds and on the NOCH website www.noch.com. You can use it to precisely calculate how much casting compound you have to mix in beforehand. Now you have to be patient. The rocks need at least 6 hours for the casting compound to harden. Ideally, you would prepare the rocks one evening and let them harden overnight. The rocks can now be pressed out of the casting molds. The demolding process is surprisingly simple. Our rocks have become very stable and do not break apart when they are removed from the mold. In this way, you can cast as many rocks as you need. Another tip: produce 2 to 3 rocks more straight away. You can test coloring on these later, before you start your masterpiece, the right rocks in your diorama. Now we want to install the rocks in our diorama. First of all, we test which rock shape fits where and in which spots rocks should be installed at all. You have to consider where it makes sense to have rocks. It may happen that individual rocks are too big. If the rocks are flat and large, they can be broken using an underlying batten by pressing down firmly on the left and right ends. As soon as the perfect position for your rocks has been found, and you are sure where your rock faces and rock pieces are to be installed in the landscape, they can be affixed with hot glue. I want my rock face to run from the summit to the waterfall. My diorama will be very craggy and alpine later. You are welcome to use fewer rocks or install them in other spots. Let yourself be inspired by pictures and photos. When installing, it is important to make sure that the gaps between the rocks remain as small as possible, as we will have to fill them in later. Bit by bit, one professional rocky section after the other is created very easily. Finally, I glue another slightly larger rock down in the lake bed of my landscape and hope that a nice depth effect will emerge later. In the next step, we cover the tabletop with some paper or newspaper to avoid getting it dirty with compound or paint. We also prepare all the tools and aids we need. As well as a wide spatula and a fine spatula, we will need paintbrushes of various widths and a glass of lukewarm water. I also got hold of an old toothbrush. Place everything close at hand next to your diorama. The NOCH modeling compound is now mixed in the rubber bowl with a tablespoon. For this, first you empty the compound into the bowl and then carefully add water. The perfect mixing ratio is between 3 to 4 parts modeling compound to 1 part water. In order to be able to fill the gaps well, the ratio should lean more towards 4:1. Here we stir in a little less water so that the compound becomes a little tougher and thus cannot flow down the rock face. So that the modeling compound bonds to the rock pieces well, we first moisten everything with a little water from a spray bottle. Now it gets exciting. We apply the modeling compound in the gaps between the rocks with a large spatula and the fine spatula. Depending on the mixing ratio, the mass can be processed for around 15 to 20 minutes. You should therefore only mix small amounts of NOCH modeling compound. We proceed in a rather rough way and try to align the gaps to the shape of the rock by modeling. In order to create a clean transition from rock to compound, we dampen a brush and carefully apply the damp compound on the abutting edges to the rock edges. Shortly before the compound hardens completely, you can scratch in grooves, joints and edges with a spatula. This is also where the toothbrush comes into action. It can be used to give the slightly damp compound texture. A tip: feel free to try out different tools here. The modeling compound can be scratched, pushed in, broken out or filled. You can find your preferred techniques by experimenting. From time to time, we hoover up dried residues and crumbs on the diorama. It is simply better to work on a clean diorama. Work your way through the landscape bit by bit, connecting the rock pieces to form contiguous rocky sections in this step. Also design all the transitions on the rock edges. I also fill my small water basin up between the two summits, from which the waterfall will feed later. Now the free areas are filled straight on the NOCH Terraform landscape crepe paper. In this way, the landscape is stabilized and smooth surfaces emerge on which we can very easily design meadows and vegetation later. In order to smooth the surfaces, the mask can be a little more liquid. The mixing ratio is then more like 3:1 and contains slightly more water. It is roughly applied with a spatula and then spread on with a white damp paintbrush. Make sure that the layer is approximately 3 mm thick in order to ensure adequate stability. The transition from NOCH Terraform crepe paper to lakebed must be filled very meticulously so that the artificial water cannot flow out later. The transition from lakebed to side panels also requires particular attention. The gaps must be filled cleanly. Also fill in any outside gaps between crepe paper and side panels with NOCH modeling compound. In this way, we fill and smooth the entire surface on the landscape and the transitions to the footprint of the building and the lake bed. The bottom of the lake and the footprint itself should not be filled. I model a small hiking trail above the footprint of the building, which will later lead up to the summits. After the modeling compound has dried out, we carefully sand the sides as well as the front and back with a sanding block, and thus achieve the perfect finish to our diorama. To color the rocky sections, we would like to use NOCH nature paints. Again, get everything ready for this step in advance. We need stirrers, such as leftover terraform struts, some kitchen roll in case something goes wrong, and glasses in which we can fill the colored glaze later. A tip: I filled the water needed to dilute the color concentrates into a dispensing bottle from the food sector beforehand. With the dosing tip, you can then precisely pour the water in milliliters into the small mixing cup. Now open the nature paint set. This contains 6 color concentrates in highly realistic natural colors, a mixing cup, a sponge spatula and instructions. Please don't be surprised if you come upon little tubs of pink, purple and green paint when you first open the packaging. The concentrates settle quickly whilst in the packaging. They must therefore be stirred thoroughly first. I recommend stirring each paint for about 5 minutes until the concentrate is uniformly mixed. The color concentrates are diluted with water in a ratio of 1 to 10. So for example, you put 5 ml of color concentrate in the mixing cup and add 50 ml of water. In our case, I put 2 times 25 ml of water in the mixing cup and then pour the resulting glaze into a glass. Like this, we prepare all 6 glazes from the natural color concentrates. The inner blister of the packaging is designed in such a way that they can be also used as a mixing palette for small amounts of colored glaze. The glazes are now applied wet on the rocks with a sponge spatula. You go from light to dark. Take your time testing the different color effects on 2 to 3 test rocks. Experiment to see which colors harmonize with each other. Take care of the dark shades brown and black. They are very intense, and you cannot remove the colors once they have been applied to the rocks. As a technique, you can either work wet on wet, that is, mix everything together on the rock, or wait until one layer of paint is dry and then apply the next dark layer of paint. You can also try out different mixing ratios. A little more water dilutes the glazes further and brightens the color impression. When you are satisfied with the results of your test, put the test rocks aside. We will need them again later. Now we can get started. We now take on the diorama. I opted for a color application of ochre, olive and light and dark gray, which I apply wet on wet. This color combination best reflects the base color of the Allgäu mountains. I apply the paints liberally with a sponge spatula. Follow the motto, the more the better. A lot of glaze should really be applied to the rocks, so that a watercolor, non-opaque color effect arises. Any excess glaze that runs down should be mopped up with a piece of kitchen roll from the base plate and the footprint of the building, so it doesn't ooze onto wood and cardboard. Make sure that you mix in enough paint before using the glazes, so that the glaze doesn't run out during application. After the base coat, I leave everything to dry a little. Then I apply 2 very liquid dark glazes. For this, I diluted the olive and black color concentrate 1 to 20 each. I now spread these 2 thin glazes liberally over the rocky sections. This technique is called inking, since the dark colors run into the recesses like liquid ink and create a wonderful dark shadow effect here. This gives the rocks depth. After the rocks have been processed uniformly, we leave the whole diorama to dry overnight. Once again, the test rocks will serve as well. In the last step, we want to wipe the rocks with NOCH acrylic paint in Ivory. In so-called dry brushing, very little paint is picked up on a dry bristle brush. This is spread on a cloth or piece of kitchen roll until it is noticeable that no more paint comes off the brush. We now gently drag this almost completely dry brush over the rock edges and thus very carefully place fine, light highlights on them. Carefully repeat the procedure a few times until you are happy with the result. A tip: it's important to drag the paintbrush over the rock and not dab. If you dab, you will get into the recesses and won't achieve a 3D effect. On the other hand, if you drag the paintbrush over the edges and elevations, you create marked light highlights and thus achieve a high depth effect, especially in contrast to the dark recesses. You can now use the dry painting technique you have just learned on the diorama. This gives the rocks the finishing touch. Your perfect NOCH PROFI rocks are now professionally colored. I hope you like your result as much as I like mine.